So I'm going to try to get through this entire review of the first episode of Clarice without mentioning the character who the writers are not allowed to mention. This is going to be tough. So I'm going to try really, really hard not to mention him who shall not be named. But his presence is all over this show, and I think that the biggest indictment of the show from my perspective is that they never distracted me enough that I wasn't thinking about that character. Drew here, and I have to say I'm probably not going to keep watching this show. I think that there are two ways that you could judge it. You could judge it as a sequel to Silence of the Lambs, or the cousin of the show with Hugh Dancy and Mads Mikkelsen. And if you judge it from that perspective, I think that it falls short pretty clearly. I think that as a procedural, it's a lot better than I expected. I have to admit on the outset that I am biased against network procedurals. I prefer more serialized stories. I prefer things that have a darker tone and a darker edge. They do apply a lot of surface level grit here. They have some nifty visuals that do kind of evoke the show with Mads Mikkelsen, but they feel kind of shoehorned in, and they don't really add to the overall themes of this world. In fact, I think they kind of distract from the story they're trying to present here, because instead of allowing Clarice to move forward with a new story, we're constantly thinking about the things that have come before. They show a lot of scenes from Silence of the Lambs, and they don't really want Clarice to have moved out from underneath the weight of Buffalo Bill and what happened in that film. Sorry if you haven't seen it. I'm assuming that most of you have, but I don't really want to delve into what happened in that film. But if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you check it out. It's a good one. But here, I think that Rebecca Breeds does a good job in this role. I think that I could easily see Clarice leading a show, even as portrayed by Rebecca Breeds. I think that it would be unfair, again, to compare her to Jodie Foster, because Jodie Foster gave one of the best performances of all time in Silence of the Lambs. It was a really marvelous piece of acting. So to expect that from Rebecca Breeds and to compare her to that would not be fair. But I do feel that this character, as portrayed here, may not be enough to anchor a show. And I would say the main reason for that is that as much as I do think that Clarice is a character that has some interest to the audience, I think to a large extent what made her truly unique as a character was that she is this person that was vulnerable, but that was still showing strength in the face, both of the kind of systematic and personal sexism that she was experiencing, and more importantly, and this is what's really lacking in this show, in the face of these really, really vile and evil antagonists. And to me, the antagonist in the first episode is just really lacking in presence. And I have a suspicion that as the episodes continue, since they're going with that episodic format, I think most of these villains or killer of the weeks are going to be largely forgettable. And I think that's a problem for this show. I think that they needed to have a more compelling antagonist for her to face. I think that to a large extent, they are arguing that the antagonist that she's facing is her own fears, that she's suffering this PTSD. She doesn't know if she can move out from underneath the weight of what has happened to her. And going along with that, I think that is a good way to develop the character. I do think that there is room for this story, but I feel that it needs to be told in conjunction with having a strong external adversary that she has to track down. And when you compare this show to its cousin, which I previously brought up with Mads Mikkelsen, and to the Netflix series Mindhunter, I think it just falls short in terms both of texture and also just psychological heft. I mentioned that it kind of sprinkles in these visuals that kind of bring to mind the Mads Mikkelsen series, but I think that they actually hurt this series because they remind you of what you're not watching, and they also kind of just tend to intrude on the mysteries in progress, which again, they're not that interesting. And I think that the inclusion of these visuals just serves to remind you how much better that story was than this one. I think that that actually serves to make you realize how much less interesting this show is, which is a problem. As a procedural, not judging it on the basis of those other properties, which is hard to do because, as I said, they keep referencing them and including these visual callbacks to them. I feel that the mystery felt rushed because they only had 40 minutes to develop it, and they're also trying to, develop this entire new cast of characters. But honestly, most of the characters don't get a whole lot of development. 3 characters show up and they basically give you a really, really generic summary of who these individuals are. He's the sniper, he can detect lies, and this person, I forget. It wasn't that interesting. The only real interesting character in this show is Clarice so far. I like the way that they're developing her relationship with the woman that she saved in Silence of the Lambs. I think that them trying to move past their victimhood is an interesting theme, and if I was going to keep watching, I think that would be the aspect that I was most interested to see explored further. But again, I think that just overall, this character, the way that they're portraying her, it's a lot less nuanced than it was in Silence of the Lambs. I also feel that her confrontations with the sexism in the workplace, they just seem more like generic, contrived confrontations that are there to kind of amplify the drama. And some of them just don't feel organic. They feel like they've been inserted rather than something that would just realistically arise in this world. I do think that these kinds of circumstances would arise, but I feel that the way that they're presented here feels less organic and more just like, well, we have to include this because this was such a big part of Silence of the Lambs. I think that setting it in 1993 was a good choice. I think that it allows them to kind of explore some of the ways in which people's understanding of serial killers and other types of criminal aspects, criminology has changed. I think that's probably the strongest aspect of the show. Overall, I thought that the writing was actually a lot better than I had feared, as were the visuals. I thought that overall, as far as like the technical aspects go, it was a fairly decent show. So you have to ask yourself if you're thinking about tuning in. If you're the type of person who likes, generic network procedurals, this might be for you. If you're looking for something that goes beyond what those can do, that has more edge, that has more heft to it, if you're looking for something like the other properties in the Thomas Harris universe, then this probably isn't going to do it for you unless you're just so desperate for more stories about Clarice Starling and about, characters in this series of stories that you're willing to overlook the fact that this is a decidedly lesser entry. I do think people are being a little bit unfair to it because it's being judged in comparison to those very superlative stories, but not honestly by that much. I don't think that this is something that you would need to tune into unless you were truly desperate for another procedural or you just wanted to see more stories in this world. So those are just my thoughts for what they are worth. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of other shows, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you for tuning in and for putting up with me.